Okay, so today I'm going to present a study which is forthcoming in the Journal of Germanic Linguistics on adjective variation in German. And in particular, it looks at adjectives of positive evaluation and examines whether there are any linguistic or social factors which influence their use. So to describe something as positive in German, speakers have a rich variety of adjectives to choose from. They can describe something as geil, krass, top, fett, toll, super, derbe, spitze, prima, klasse, fantastisch, mega, abgefahren, ausgezeichnet, bombig, cool. They have a variety of adjectives to choose from. And at the level of discourse, these adjectives are really functionally equivalent. That is to say that there's not really any functional difference between describing something as toll versus super versus cool. The intention of the speaker is the same. That is, they employ these adjectives to express or denote positive evaluation. But the question from a variationist sociolinguistic standpoint is the decision to use one of these adjectives over a functionally equivalent counterpart random or haphazard, or is there orderly heterogeneity? So immediately when we look at these adjectives, we can see some geographical differences. So for instance, Leiwand is an adjective of positive evaluation, which typically indexes an Austrian variety or Austrian varieties of German. Pfundig indexes varieties of Bavarian German, and Herzig indexes Swiss varieties of German. But beyond geographical differences, what other factors play a role? Geography has long played a role in German dialectology, but what about other social factors? What about gender and age? Do women make different lexical choices? Do they use different adjectives to men? Are younger speakers using the same adjectives as older speakers? Well, this was found to be partially the case in work on English. So Sally Tagliamonte and colleagues have looked at two semantic fields of adjectives. In a 2014 study, they looked at adjectives of strangeness in English. So these are adjectives such as strange, odd, bizarre, weird, funny. And what they found is that age was a significant factor, with younger speakers or speakers under the age of 50 and 60 using weird, whereas older speakers didn't use weird and they used adjectives such as strange and bizarre. In a later study, Tagliamonte and Pabst 2020, on adjectives of positive evaluation, they also found that age was a significant factor, with younger speakers using adjectives such as cool, whereas older speakers don't typically use adjectives such as cool, but they use adjectives such as terrific. And the same goes in reverse. Younger speakers don't really say, oh, the movie was terrific. They say the movie was cool. So based on this previous literature, this motivates the first two research questions. First, what is the current distribution of German adjectives of positive evaluation? In other words, which adjectives are currently available, which adjectives are currently used, what's their frequency, which adjectives are more frequent, which ones are not so frequent, and secondly, is this semantic field influenced by linguistic and social factors? So do social factors such as gender and age play a role? Well, there's been very little research on this in German, but there are two notable studies that will serve as important points of reference. So the first study is Schenker 1977, and what Schenker found is that in the 1970s, astrein, klasse, and dufte were the most popular variants of or adjectives to express positive evaluation. And they also noted this incoming use of geil among men and poppig among women. Fast forward 20 years, geil then was noted to be the most frequent among younger speakers, followed by other variants such as genial, kultig, and korrekt. So based on this previous literature, if we compare the present study with these two previous studies, what can we say about the semantic field in terms of how it's changed over time? So how has this semantic field changed in recent history? So to approach these three research questions, I use variationist quantitative methods, which are being used widely in work on English, but not so much in work on German, although this is slowly and gradually changing. So what I did is I compiled a list of positive evaluation adjectives from previous literature, from dictionaries and thesauruses, and also by asking native speakers, what adjectives would you use to describe something as positive? And then I had a nice long list. And then I used this list and searched for their occurrence in a spoken corpus. And the corpus I used was the Forschungs- und Lehrkorpus gesprochenes Deutsch, the Volk. And this is a 1.6 million word spoken corpus which contains spoken interactions from a variety of different settings, so formal and informal. And what's great about this corpus from a sociolinguistic standpoint is it's reasonably balanced for gender and age. The speakers are reasonably balanced. And what's useful for this particular study is it contains 21st century data, so we can make comparisons with the adjectives that are used in the 21st century and the adjectives that were used in the 70s and the 90s. So to circumscribe the variable context, I had to manually remove semantically non-comparable or semantically non-equivalent tokens. So for instance, the example in A here was acceptable. So es war super, es war krass. So super and krass are both adjectives of positive valuation. But in B, super and krass were not included in the envelope variation because they're intensifiers. Es war super langweilig und es war krass geil. So these two were not included. So I had to manually go through the data. I downloaded the list of adjectives and I had to manually go through the data to remove any semantically non-equivalent or comparable tokens. So let's take a look at the results, first starting with the distributional analysis. So what I found is that cool was the #1 adjective of positive valuation, making up 22% of the system, followed by toll, which made up 20%, and then this intensifier gut construction, which made up 18%. And the intensifier gut construction is any intensifier plus gut, so sehr gut, voll gut, super gut, echt gut, etc. Now, when we look at these adjectives in apparent time, we can see some clear generational differences. So the red line here refers to the frequency or the use of toll across different generational cohorts. And what we can see is that it decreases the younger the speaker, so it decreases in apparent time. Whereas cool, this blue line here, actually increases in apparent time. The younger the speaker, the higher the frequency of cool. So this is indicative of a change in progress. Now, descriptively speaking, I also found some gender differences. So cool was used more frequently made up a larger share of the female system for adjectives of positive valuation than for male speakers. But for male speakers use the intensifier gut construction more frequently than female speakers. As one might expect, I found some register differences. So cool was favored more in informal contexts, and the same goes for geil. It's only really used in informal contexts. It's not really found in formal contexts. I also found some descriptive evidence to suggest that the syntactic position of the adjective plays a role. So depending on the position of an adjective, we can describe it or categorize it as an attributive adjective, a predicative adjective, or a standalone adjective. And what I found is that incoming variants, new adjectives to this semantic field, have a tendency to be used most frequently in standalone position. So nice, this is a loan word from English, was only attested in standalone position in the corpus. So you couldn't say I didn't find anything like der nicer Film or anything like that. So just nice, sehr nice, voll nice. So it was not attested in attributive position. It was only used in standalone position. The same goes for top, an incoming and recent variant to the semantic field. So for instance, der ist top, not used in attributive position. And the same goes for cool. It was used predominantly in predicative and standalone position. So, oh cool, es war echt cool. Now this is in line with a Klein proposed by Tagliamonte and Pabst in 2020 in their paper, the general systemic evolution for newly developing forms. And what they proposed is that new adjectives to semantic fields first appear in standalone position, then later develop the predicative function, and then later develop attributive function. And this seems to, my data seems to support this syntactic line. So now to the multivariate analysis. I ran a series of mixed effects binary logistic regression models in Arborol, including speaker as a random or mixed factor, and I included gender, age, and syntactic position as independent variables. So let's take a look at the output of the logistic regression models. So this is the first model, which was run on cool versus all other variants, so it was coded binomially. And what I found is that the sex of the speaker, or gender, was a significant factor, with women using cool more frequently than men. I also found age to be a significant factor, with younger speakers using cool more frequently than older speakers, and also the syntactic position played a role where cool was favored in standalone as opposed to attributive or predicative function. Moving on to toll, what we find is that with toll, the sex of a speaker also played a role, used more frequently by women than men. But we see the opposite tendency with age. So whereas cool was favored by younger speakers, toll was favored by older speakers, suggesting that it's an outgoing variant. And this is in line with that apparent time data. And in contrast to cool, where it was favored in standalone or bare position, toll is favored in attributive position, and that's likely because it's been around for quite some time. So if we think back to that syntactic line, it's because it's further along in the syntactic line because it's been around for much longer. There's a couple of things I want to say about some of these adjectives, specific adjectives. Geil is an adjective that everyone likes to talk about, and one of the reasons why everyone likes to talk about it is it used to mean something like horny or sexually arousing or sexually aroused. So when someone says something like ein geiles Moped, literally, some people might say, well, it means a horny moped, but of course it doesn't mean that, because geil has undergone semantic change. It's undergone, the original meaning has been bleached semantically. So now geil is just a generic word for, or to express positive evaluation. When someone says eine geile Wohnung, they're really referring to the fact that it's a great apartment and doesn't have any kind of sexual reference there. So geil has changed its meaning over time. It's undergone semantic bleaching. But one of the interesting things with geil is many people associate its use with younger speakers, with Jugendsprache. Now, while that used to be the case, as we saw from the previous literature, geil was actually introduced in the 70s and kind of hit its peak in the 90s. And we can actually see that based on the apparent time data. Geil is this little gold line, and we can see that it was the most frequent among the 35 to the 44 cohort, but then it actually starts to decrease as speakers as new generations acquire the language. So even though geil is used more frequently by younger speakers than speakers in the 50 plus range, it's not one of the top variants. It's actually somewhat of an outgoing variant. So this is actually quite surprising. Now the same goes for Klasse and Prima. Originally these were thought to be youth aspects, or these to be indicative of youth speech, Jugendsprache, and while that was the case at one point, speakers have aged and now that's no longer the case. And younger speakers, new generations today, are not really using those adjectives, or at least not at high frequency. So Klasse is this little green line here, and you can see that it just decreases as age decreases. And the same goes with Prima. So what are young speakers using? Well, we saw that they're using cool, but they're also using krass. It was intensified most frequently using constructions such as voll, echt, and so. So it was used often in combination with an intensifier, but it was used most frequently by the 15 to 35 cohort. There are also new incoming variants which were particularly infrequent in the corpus, such as nice, but they were still attested. So there are lots of new variants that younger speakers are using, but they're not really using geil as frequently as people would think. So what are the main takeaways from this study? What are the main contributions? Well, first and foremost, I found that cool has become the dominant variant, the dominant adjective of positive evaluation in German. Its use increased in apparent time among younger speakers, and this is indicative of a change in progress. And this actually correlates in frequency with a decrease in toll, in the frequency of toll among younger speakers. I also found that there are some clear changes within this onomasological set. Variants or adjectives such as astrein, which were well attested in the 70s, were rarely attested in the data, and kultig, korrekt, and knorke were simply not used by younger speakers. And this goes to show that the semantic field of positive valuation is a perpetually changing one. Geil was once considered Jugendsprache, youth language, but now those speakers have aged and they've continued to use it, and they've propagated its use to younger generations, but it's not a top variant. Variants such as cool and krass are used more frequently by younger speakers. I also found that there are linguistic and social factors which constrain the use of these different adjective choices, with significant age and gender differences observed. And this is in line with recent variationist scholarship, showing that various social factors influence German variation and change. That's not to downplay the role of geography. Geography has played an important role in German dialectology and German language variation and change, but it goes to show that there are other factors beyond geography which can be used as explanatory factors, social factors such as gender, age, and identity. I also found that this increase in cool was actually being led by young women, and this is in line with the general principles of linguistic change, which suggest that women are at the forefront or spearhead linguistic change. And finally, there seems to be some support with my data for the syntactic line proposed in the literature where new incoming variants to the semantic field appear more frequently in standalone position and then later develop a predicative or attributive function, whereas outgoing variants have a tendency to occur in attributive position. So thank you for listening. If you're interested in reading the paper, it's about to come out. I have the full reference of the paper on the screen here. And I'll go to the next slide to show you the references. And if you have any questions, I'll be available during question time. And of course, if you're not able to ask any questions or you have some comments that you can't ask during that time, my email address is also on the slide. So thank you very much.